You know, I thought the country was becoming radicalized and lawless. I had been reading more alternative sources, but basically my worldview of the world at the time was formed by reading what I thought were the sophisticated, high-end political media outlets like The New Yorker and The New York Times, which I read every day, and I thought I was a fairly informed consumer of political news. I was, skeptical of things. I was cynical about what I was reading, but I thought I had the basic narrative right. And once I had the luxury, writing about politics full time, of going and really looking at things firsthand and not having to rely on mediation of newspaper editors or television reporters, and could read documents firsthand and could interview people myself, and had a lot of luxury at the time of luxuriously sort of pondering things and thinking about them, that's when I started realizing just how radically flawed the narrative was that I had been fed, and really came to kind of distrust those sources and even be sort of angry at the way that I felt like I had been deceived and misled. And that's when I sort of started focusing a lot more on the need to critique media outlets and the way that they propagandize and form public opinion, and more so to just erase all of the suppositions that I had that I thought I knew about political reality and the basic narrative, and kind of rebuild it from scratch. And I think that's probably been the most valuable experience, is just having to erase that whole template.
Okay, that wasn't that dishy, but it was interesting.
I moved away from the dishiness very quickly and subtly.
Maybe one of the questioners from the audience will get you there. We're going to open it up now, and I think we have a microphone. Yes, right there up front. And we're going to take questions for about 15, 20 minutes, and then we'll break, and Glenn's going to stick around a little while for members of Salon Court, sign books, and chat. Okay. Hi, can you give us your name?
Yeah, my name's Jonathan from OccupyGovernment.org. And what I wanted to ask you, Glenn, in your greatest aspiration, in your wildest dreams, where do you see the Occupy movement going in the 2012 election and in the future?
I think one of the parts of one of the things that make the Occupy movement so exciting is that it's very difficult to predict what it's going to end up being. And so my hope for it isn't so specific that it'll achieve a discrete outcome. My hope for it is that it'll just continue to grow and attract citizens who have decided that they are no longer willing to tolerate the status quo. And that it continues to be disruptive and continues to be tumultuous and continues to prevent things from continuing along the same path that they've been on, and finally will make the political class pay attention to the citizens whom they are claiming to represent, rather than to the very narrow special interests. That it'll just be an earthquake in our political landscape. And I think the status quo is sufficiently corrupted that just kind of shaking things up and radically changing them, although that can be dangerous and that can be risky, is something that ought to be pursued, because the status quo is infinitely more damaging and dangerous, I think, than any of those outcomes.
Right. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm John Mark from San Francisco.
Hi.
And I just wanted to ask, since you seem to have had a political awakening in the past few years around Barack Obama and the Democrats, have you given any thought to third-party organizing, like joining the Green Party? I'm not saying you should necessarily run for president right away, but you could...
You're going to give me a few years for that to get ready? I appreciate that. I think the problem with third parties, aside from the fact that the whole system is constructed to make them ineffective in all kinds of ways, so that basically only a billionaire can mount a viable challenge, is that lots of people who would be otherwise willing to support it have these memories of Ralph Nader in their minds. This is the perception anyway, having elected George Bush. And so I think one of the problems is that the third-party route has become sufficiently stigmatized, including among people who would otherwise be sympathetic to it, that it's a very hard subject to broach in a persuasive way. But I think that we're clearly headed in the direction where partisan loyalties are eroding rapidly. And to the extent that people whose partisan loyalties erode want to continue to be involved electorally, I do think that the prospect of third parties is going to become more viable. I mean, ultimately the question is, if you continue to support the Democratic Party blindly, they're going to continue to ignore you. That's just basic political reality. And although there's some short-term harm to stopping that, namely if you stop supporting the Democrats, you help the Republicans, there's long-term considerations and middle-term considerations that have to be weighed against that, namely how do you break this kind of spousal abusive pattern of being addicted to a party that makes clear that they don't care about you at all. And that ultimately is how that question has to be weighed. I don't necessarily have the answer for you yet.
Well, one person at a time. So.
All right, good.
Hi, I'm Josh from San Francisco. I had a couple of questions. The first is about accountability now. You had a PAC, I think it was in 2010, to sort of elect more and better Democrats.
Right.
And I was wondering if you still see that as a valid sort of approach, given all of the things that have happened since then. And the second was a question about Dylan Ratigan's constitutional amendment that is all about getting money out of politics, and if you think that's even sort of coherent in a constitutional sense and something that can go somewhere.
Dylan Ratigan constitutional amendment, it's hard to imagine that being overwhelmingly coherent, although I'm sure it's probably well-intentioned. I tend to think that the way to solve the whole problem with money is to have a very robust public financing system so that if a certain candidate is receiving many millions of dollars from the securities industry and the banking industry, there's a public fund that will equal the playing field so that they don't have to be captive any longer to those interests. That's exactly why it won't happen, is because that would be the ultimate way to subvert this, oligarchical stranglehold on the political system. And your first question was?
About accountability now.
Right. So, yeah, in 2008, actually, I formed with a couple other people this organization, and the idea was to create this infrastructure that would support progressive primary challengers to bad Democratic incumbents, which is almost a redundancy. And we actually succeeded in putting together a really impressive coalition of labor unions who are going to provide the money and leading political blogs that could provide message amplification, and other political consultants and the like. And so then in 2010, it was sort of hard to recruit candidates, but the candidate that we were successful in recruiting was Bill Halter, who was a candidate in Arkansas who challenged from the left Blanche Lincoln. And after spending a huge amount of time on this process, I actually began to imagine what would happen if Bill Halter actually beat Blanche Lincoln and became a senator from Arkansas. And what I kind of realized is that the answer to that was nothing. What would things be different if Bill Halter became a senator instead of Blanche Lincoln? And the reason is that even when people start out sort of as insurgents, the incentives, the institutional incentives to be a good party soldier are so compelling. It's why I'm not particularly excited about Elizabeth Warren going to the Senate, even though I think what she's done has been magnificent and she's an outstanding advocate. It's actually because I think she's so outstanding that I don't want to see her get eaten up by, because what happens is they get to Washington, they want to be on committees. In order to get on committees, they have to curry favor with Harry Reid and the political leadership. In order to have influence, they have to keep favor with the White House. To stay in power, they have to raise tons of money from the party's fundraising apparatus, and all of these pressures homogenize these people so that even when they get to Washington as fairly decent human beings, they quickly become something else in terms of how their public service manifests. And that's why I just, even though I did think that that was one potential viable approach for a couple of years, having seen it up close and even imagining the best case scenario, I sort of concluded that that wasn't particularly exciting to me any longer. So.
It's terrible to hear, but thanks for your help.
Hi, Lorenzo. Thank you for being here. Particularly given that we're in the middle of Condoleezza Rice's book tour / media blitz, some of us have to get our enjoyment from things like George Bush having to cancel a trip to Switzerland. Is there anything that you see in the realm of international law or any people anywhere around the world or domestically that kind of give you hope that there's going to be some accountability for some of the war crimes of the Bush administration?
No.
Okay.
No, and I say that, sincerely. One of the problems is that foreign relations is really a byproduct of power. And so in order for a country to step up and prosecute American leaders as war criminals, they would have to be willing to incur a huge amount of political attacks from the United States. And one of the interesting things is, we talk a lot about the Obama administration's refusal to prosecute Bush officials for the crimes they committed. The problem is it extends much beyond that. So the Justice Department has been desperate to keep their victims out of court and not even to have judicial rulings on whether or not what they did was illegal. But beyond that, there were other countries that started the process and seemed committed to investigating Bush officials for crimes like Spain and Germany, because their citizens were among the victims at Guantanamo and in Afghanistan, who were rendered to countries to be tortured, who were tortured in American custody, and they felt an obligation, and their citizens were demanding that they investigate criminally whether Bush officials had breached the Convention Against Torture. And there are treaties that compel these countries, not permit them, but compel them to investigate and prosecute any foreign leaders who torture their own citizens. And there were cables that WikiLeaks published that Bradley Manning is alleged to have leaked that documented how in the beginning of the Obama presidency, they unleashed this full-fledged diplomatic war against Germany and Spain to persuade / cajole / pressure / bully and threaten and intimidate them out of pursuing those investigations. And it worked. Those investigations were shut down. Those cables made huge headlines in Spain and Germany, as you can imagine, because basically the Obama administration succeeded in subverting the independence of their judicial processes by preventing investigations. And if Germany and Spain can't stand up to that kind of pressure, even though when their own citizens were tortured and were subjected to other forms of rendition and abuses, it's hard to see any country or certainly any international tribunal that ever will. You know, maybe 25 years from now, when they're all dead or on the verge of being dead, and the United States has far less power vis-a-vis other countries, something like an Augusto Pinochet inquiry will happen somewhere, but it'll be much less satisfying, and it won't have much value. Then it's essentially they will have gotten away with their war crimes. That seems pretty inevitable now, and that's pretty much the exclusive doing of the current administration.
Thank you.
Hi, Glenn. This is Michael Steger. I'm with LaRouchePack.com.
Hey.
Hi. I really appreciate your recent reporting on Salon.com regarding the military buildup in the Middle East, these 3 carrier fleets. And so my question pertains to that. Given the fact that the Obama administration is now, through executive decree and secret executive committee, assassinating American citizens abroad, including 16-year-olds, and we have a kind of elimination of an entire regime in Libya with unprecedented kind of criminal character. The recent buildup in the Middle East in the context of this financial crisis, which obviously is similar to what we saw in the early 20th century. And Mr. LaRouche, who I work for, has said, look, the Middle East right now is the new Balkans. And we're looking at a new world war breaking out, which is targeting Russia and China explicitly with the connections to Syria and Iran. Where do you stand on the immediate removal of Obama to remove this threat of world war, which clearly he's going towards? And do you see other ways of stopping the problem?
Well, you know, I think one of the interesting things is that a lot of times we can look at what happens in other countries and we can see truths that are prevailing in our country, but we don't apply it to us. So, for example, we are aware of the fact and talk a lot about the fact that one of the things the Iranian leadership likes to do is it manufactures conflicts with foreign powers because that distracts from the anger at their leadership on the part of the citizenry over economic suffering. So when you have a foreign enemy and a country perceives that you're being attacked or in some way treated unfairly, the citizenry rallies behind the domestic political leadership. It's sort of a reaction of nationalism. And this is what political leaders have done for time immemorial, is they've focused on foreign enemies, real and perceived, real and manufactured, in order to distract attention. So what was stunning to me was just how incredibly cynical was this latest claim that the Iranian government, this nefarious, sophisticated government, had hired a used car salesman in Texas who, according to all his friends and neighbors, can't even find his keys most of the time. And has a history of failing to pay his bills, to then go and contract with, you know, a Mexican drug cartel to then assassinate a Saudi ambassador on U.S. soil. I mean, it just seems so obvious that this was simply an attempt to continue the demonization of Iran for all sorts of political benefits. And you see that in lots of other countries as well. I mean, every time, there is some sort of new terrorist that the Obama administration succeeds in killing, or a new threat that's presented by a foreign power, it benefits the president politically. That's not unique to Obama. That's true generally of foreign countries and our own. But as far as removing Obama or anything like that, I mean, whenever anyone asks me about that, I have two words in reply, and those two words are Joe Biden. I just don't think that removing Obama is going to achieve anything, because I don't think Obama is actually the problem. I think the problem is systemic. The problem with our political culture is far more fundamental than which particular politician